Hello, students. Today we'll be working on your Notes 10. We're going to be solving rational equations. Rational means fractions, so equations that have fractions in them. And so, as with any time you work with fractions, you often have to find the least common denominator. And we'll be doing that, but not really getting a common denominator. We're actually going to use it to clear the fractions. Then we'll solve what we get afterwards. Notice that really anything's fair game, including maybe having to use the quadratic formula. And then you will have to make sure that you exclude any solutions that would cause your denominator to equal 0. We actually will think about that first so that we'll know if we have any problems. So we'll look at our first example, and we have x over 2 minus x over 3 equaling 18. So this idea of the excluded values, if either denominator has a variable in it, then we would not want to find a value for that variable that would cause us to have a 0 in the denominator. But since these neither one are variables, we will not have that issue. So in this blank for excluded values, I'm going to put that we'll have none. All answers will be acceptable. And this is because we have no variables in the denominator. So since we have no variables in the denominator, we don't have to worry about having a 0 in the denominator. Okay, so our next task is to find the least common denominator. And so we'll look at our two denominators and actually just have to multiply those together. So 2 times 3 is going to give us 6. 6 is going to be our least common denominator. Now, rather than getting a common denominator, we're actually going to use the 6 as a multiplier to clear out the fractions. So this is how I'm going to write it. I'm going to take my 6, my common denominator, put it over 1, and multiply it by my first fraction, x over 2. And then notice I have a minus sign. I'm going to go ahead and write that. I'm going to write another 6 over 1. This is my common denominator again, times my next term, which was x over 3. And then my equal sign, and I'll be taking my common denominator 6. Now I'm not going to put it over 1 this time because I'm multiplying it by this whole number 18. So there's no reason to write that as a fraction. All right, now the whole idea of doing this is that we can do some cancellation. So I can cancel this 2 into this 6, and when I do so, 2 will go into itself and give me a 1. 2 will go into 6 3 times. And notice that my denominators are 1, and my numerator then is 3x. And so I don't need to write the over 1, and that's the whole point. I'll get rid of my denominators. So 3x is what I get from this. All right, then I have minus, and I'll go on to my next division. I can cancel my 3 and 6. 3 goes into itself once and gives me a 1. 3 goes into 6 2 times, and so 2 times x over 1. I don't need to write the 1, so I'll have 2x, and then equals, and then here I don't have fractions, I just need to multiply. So 6 times 18 would give me 108. So in this line, we have cleared the fractions. We no longer have fractions. And now we're ready to solve whatever the equation is. Well, in this case, I have like terms. 3x minus 2x is 1x. So I have 1x equals 108. And I know some of you like to show that division. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We'll divide both sides by 1. And I'm just going to finish up my work over here. I'll end up with x equals 108. And that's my solution. So if you have a blank where you're supposed to write your solution, something like this, you could either put it in a solution set or just write x equals 108. So that would be your solution to the equation. Notice that it was not an excluded value. In fact, we didn't have any because we didn't have any variables in the denominator, so there was no way that our denominator could equal a 0. All right, so we'll move on and we'll look at our second problem. Now, our second problem does have variables in the denominator. In fact, it has a v. So what we'll do is we'll set that denominator v equal to 0. Now, there's nothing to solve, but obviously when v is a 0, our denominator is a 0. So that means that our excluded value is v, and I'm going to put a not equal 0, and I'm actually going to erase this work because we really didn't need to show it. And I don't want that to be confusing. So our excluded value is v cannot be a 0. So if we work this problem and we end up with v equaling 0, then we would actually have to say that it has no solution because v can't equal 0, giving us a 0 in the denominator. All right, our next task is to find the least common denominator. And your least common denominator is found by taking your two denominators, which are the v and the 3, and multiplying those together and writing it as 3v. And I'm going to take that common denominator of 3v and put it over 1 and multiply that by each term on both sides of the equal sign. So first of all, by 3 over v, notice I have a plus sign next. Then I'll write my common denominator again, 3v over 1. Multiply that by my next term, which is the fraction 1/3. Then I have my equal sign, my common denominator of 3v. Again, I'll put it over 1 because I'm multiplying it by the fraction 6 over v. All right, so now I'm ready to simplify. My v will cancel, not the 3's, but the diagonal v's will cancel, leaving 1's. So 3 times 1 times 3 gives me 9. I have my plus sign. And then here my 3's will cancel. And so those leave 1's. And so I'll have 1 times v times 1. That's just v. And I have my equal sign. V's cancel again, leaving 1's. And then 3 times 1 times 6 gives me 18. Each one of these has a 1 in the denominator, so I don't want to write the denominator. The whole idea was to get rid of the fractions. Now I have an equation to solve. I can subtract 9 from both sides of the equal sign. The 9's will cancel. And that'll leave me with v equals, and then 18 minus 9 is 9. I want to check that my 9 is not an excluded value. It is not. And so my solution is the 9. Okay, and we have one last problem to look at. Now, this one looks a little more complicated, but actually is not. However, we'll start it with the excluded value. Now, I have two denominators, but they're the same. So I want to know what value would make that denominator equal to 0. So I can just take my denominator, set it equal to 0, and solve. That means I could subtract 1 from both sides of the equal sign and get x equals -1. So that -1 is an excluded value. That means that if I get an answer and it's -1, I'll have to throw that answer out because that would create a 0 in the denominator. Okay, next task is find the least common denominator. And I only have the one denominator. It's just written in two places. So my least common denominator is x plus 1. And so like my other problems, I'm going to put that common denominator over 1 and multiply it by every term. And now this time, it looks, like I said, a little more complicated. My first term is this fraction x plus 2 over x plus 1. Then I have an equal sign. I want to write my common denominator again, x plus 1 over 1. Multiply that by my second term, which is 1 over x plus 1. Now, notice that for these, I have to cancel everything because the x plus 1 is connected. So if I put it in parentheses, that'll help me see it. So I can cancel the entire parentheses, leaving a 1. 1 times x plus 2 just leaves me with x plus 2. All right, then I have my equal sign. Now, on this one, I can cancel. I have an x plus 1 and an x plus 1. So those cancel, leaving 1s. Now, it's tempting to say that there's nothing here at all, but I need a number on this side. So 1 times 1 is 1. And so now I have the equation x plus 2 equals 1. I can subtract 2 from each side of the equal sign. My 2's cancel, and I get x equals 1 minus 2, which is -1. But I look up here and I see that I've already determined that my x cannot be -1, and yet that's what I got for a solution. So in this case, my solution is actually not possible. And so my solution I will state as no solution. Even though I did do the correct work, it's a value that we had to exclude. And so my answer is no solution because it was an excluded value. All right, so this is just a small sample of the different types of equations that you could get, but oftentimes they turn out to be equations that just have an x that you need to get by itself. Sometimes they could have x squareds in them, in which case you'll need to get it equal to 0 and either do the factoring or quadratic formula to solve. So this will be for homework 11 on Math Excel, and good luck with your work.